Possiamo iniziare con lo streaming. So I think we can start. Good afternoon to everyone, in particular to our PDH students in legal and political sciences. I'm very pleased to welcome here today a very, very special guest, Ambassador Emil Brix, who joined us from Vienna to hold a lecture on a very actual topic. He will talk to us on the Central European positions on the Russian war in Ukraine. And before we begin, I would like to greet also some guests and friends that I see here in the audience. I would like to greet the ambassador to the Holy See of the Republic of Northern Macedonia, Maria Efremova, and Alisa Muserges from the International Development Law Organization, and Giorgio Bartolomucci from the Festival della Diplomazia, with whom we co-organized today's lecture. To all of you, many thanks for being with us for this interesting and promising afternoon. And now I give the floor to Professor Chiarelli, the director of the Department of Legal and Political Sciences of the Marconi University, for a few greetings and a short introduction. Professor Chiarelli wird auf Italienisch sprechen und gerne über Allora, ti la parola.
Con grande piacere che porto il saluto del Dipartimento di Studi Giuridici e Politici dell'Università Guglielmo Marconi a questa iniziativa che è veramente nel solco di una istanza che abbiamo voluto esprimere col Dipartimento ormai da un po' di tempo, da quando è iniziata la guerra in Ucraina, dall'inizio dell'attacco russo, abbiamo avvertito l'esigenza di approfondire la problematica che sarebbe derivata dalla guerra, giocando su un'ipotesi, insistendo su un'ipotesi che la guerra in Ucraina avrebbe cambiato tutto non solo nella politica, nei rapporti politici, diplomatici tra gli stati e le potenze, ma anche nella ricerca. Gli studi del diritto, della storia, della politologia saranno di tutte le scienze umane, tenderanno ad essere differenti, cambiate, saranno cambiati molti problemi, molti argomenti dall'inizio della guerra. E molto l'ipotesi dei cambiamenti che la guerra ucraina avrebbe apportato, abbiamo cominciato a formulare quando abbiamo fatto un convegno qui con la professoressa Strada, che è la figlia di Strada, un studioso di vicende russe, che è italiano, che però ha approfondito la problematica della crisi dell'organizzazione leninista, pur non essendo né storico né giurista né politologo, ha fornito elementi essenziali per comprendere il percorso della crisi dell'Unione Sovietica. E da questa iniziativa che facemmo allora, in cui avvertivamo l'esigenza di approfondire lo studio di ciò che sarebbe cambiato con la guerra di Ucraina, approfondire che cosa succedeva con la guerra di Ucraina, abbiamo trovato conferme di questo, perché il mondo è molto cambiato e sta cambiando parecchio. E noi siamo costretti, anche i giuristi, oramai non possiamo più studiare come nel Medioevo solamente de iure condito. Siamo costretti ad approfondire il de iure condendo, perché il confine tra ius conditum e ius condendum è sempre più vicino, è sempre più, per cui non possiamo rifiutarsi di approfondire i problemi del cambiamento. I problemi del cambiamento sono evidenti quando sono rimesse in discussione tutta una serie di equilibri, una serie di problemi a livello internazionale, a partire dall'ONU. La vicenda recente, il conflitto esploso in Palestina, non è una sequenza del vecchio conflitto israele-palestinese del passato, è qualche cosa di nuovo, direttamente collegato alla vicenda complessiva di un mondo in cui il bipolarismo si ripresenta rispetto ad un'alleanza che fa perno tra la Russia, la Cina e l'Iran e il resto del mondo occidentale, che tende a coalizzarsi, a creare. E c'è un problema, l'Europa al centro di questo e di problemi del centro Europa e dell'Europa orientale, è un terreno su cui si valuterà l'avvenire di un discorso. Il discorso politico ed il discorso di diritto internazionale, ma anche di diritto costituzionale, impone delle istanze di maggiore verità. E qui c'è un problema che riguarda gli studiosi e riguarda in sé la politica e la diplomazia. Sia la politica che la diplomazia implicano ricerca. I risultati però della ricerca a livello diplomatico e politico sono presentati in modo diverso. Vi sono cose che si dicono e cose che si regolano il tempo. Si possono dire in un tempo e devono essere dette in un altro tempo. La ricerca nell'università invece si deve dire tutto. Se non si ricerca la verità nelle università e se non la si dice, si determina una torsione che si ripercuote su tutto il resto. Dobbiamo quindi, le cose che non dobbiamo dire sono quelle che consideriamo sbagliate, che consideriamo false, solo quelle non dobbiamo dire, il resto dobbiamo dirlo. E questo è necessario perché si impone un problema di rettifica di una politica che si era sviluppata all'indomani del secondo conflitto mondiale e che per tutta una serie di ragioni ha comportato un distacco molto forte tra il discorso politico e la verità. La Carta dell'ONU, fondamentale su cui si reggeva il nuovo equilibrio, un elemento fondamentale sull'equilibrio mondiale, si basava su delle cose che erano accettate come inattuabili, come false. Quindi su un elemento, e questo si esprime oggi in modo. Lo sforzo eccezionale che il dottorato di ricerca e l'impegno di Politiche e del Quercia ha condotto in questo sforzo, in questa università, in questa attività, ci conferma dell'opportunità di insistere su questa ricerca e soprattutto sull'approccio interdisciplinare, sul dialogo, sul discorso tra la ricerca universitaria e la politica, la diplomazia. Mi scuso per aver parlato un po' troppo, ma ero moltemente contento di partecipare, di esprimere la mia il mio piacere per questa iniziativa che si è portata avanti. Grazie.
Grazie mille Raffaele anche di partecipare, anche di aver voluto inserito questa attività anche nelle attività del Dipartimento da te Andrea coordinato. And now we have also the pleasure to have here Dr. Arturo Lavalle. He is the head of the research and development area of our university. He is also responsible for the internationalization of our university. And thank you for being here. And
thank you, Ulrike, for this invitation. Good afternoon, everybody. On behalf of our President, Dr. Alessia Comanni, I'm very pleased to welcome you in our university headquarters. I'm also pleased to host once again an event in the framework of the Diplomacy Festival, with which we have often collaborated over the years. And I'm also delighted to have today with us, along with our excellent professors and the audience, the Ambassador Dr. Emil Brix. Thanks for joining us. The theme of the day is very important. It's of the utmost importance, as it is important to understand the different aspects, approaches, details of a war that, apart from the countries that are directly involved, has a significant impact on the European region, with very strong consequences. And I think also that this has to be read in the framework of a wider international scenario, as Professor Chiarelli was saying, which is becoming more and more complex, which is due to geopolitical shifts and the resurgence of conflicts that have remained unsettled, like the one on the disputed region of the Nagorno-Karabakh between Azerbaijan and Armenia, and of course the Israeli-Palestinian war. So I'm very interested in listening to and learning from the different speeches, and I wish you a very pleasant seminar, and thank you for being here once again.
So and now I have the pleasure to say some words about our guest speaker. Ambassador Dr. Emil Brix is currently the director of the Austrian Diplomatic Academy of Vienna, of the Vienna School on International Studies, which is the oldest diplomatic school in the world. He was born in Vienna. There he graduated in history and achieved also his PhD degree. In 1982 he joined the diplomatic service. From 1986 to 1989 he worked for the Austrian Parliament and was the head of the cabinet of the Austrian Minister of Science and Research. During the 1990s, Mr. Brix served as Austrian Consul General in Krakow in Poland, before moving to London, where he was for 4 years the director of the Austrian Cultural Institute. After serving 5 years as the Austrian ambassador to the United Kingdom, he became Austrian ambassador to the Russian Federation in 2015. But besides his career as a diplomat, Mr. Brix is also an experienced researcher. He's a member of the governing board of the Austrian Research Association, and till 2022 he has been also the deputy chairman of a very important research institute, of the Institute for the Danube region and Central Europe. He's doing a lot of conferences with research organizations of Eastern European countries, and he has published numerous books and articles on the history of Austria and Central Europe. His first momentous books, entitled Projekt Mitteleuropa, it was a long time ago, it was in 1986, and it was published before the fall of the Iron Curtain. So you started very early to study the Central European countries. But among all your publications, I wanted to cite the book you brought here. May I show it to our students? This book is entitled Central Europe Revisited, Why Europe's Future Will Be Decided in the Region. And in this book, Mr. Briggs and his co-author emphasize to pay more attention to Central Europe, more attention to Mitteleuropa, the string of European countries between Germany and Russia. Today, there are two major approaches to Central Europe. For some, Mitteleuropa has turned into a fragmented and marginalized region, offering no proposals for the future of Europe, showing lack of solidarity in the migration crisis, and keeping political stability only at the cost of strong nationalist, populist politics. For others, Mitteleuropa is one of Europe's greatest success stories, because the region has succeeded in its peaceful transformation to democracy and market economy, as well as in its integration into Western European economic and security structures. With this consideration, which is then the perspective of Central European countries towards the unjustifiable Russian war in Ukraine? Is the Russian war a fundamental change in Europe, a turning point for the relations between Central Europe, the European Union, and Russia? Which are the contributions that Central European states are making in this dangerous situation? Is it a chance for Central European countries to develop a stronger European role? Ambassador Briggs has been a privileged observer of the European enlargement process. And during his working life as a diplomat in London, Moscow, and Poland, he experienced also different ways of dealing with European matters and thinking about Europe. With this careful consideration in mind, we can think of no one more appropriate as you, Ambassador Briggs, for today's lecture with the title Central European Positions on the Russian War in Ukraine. So I give you the floor.
Thank you.
You have 45, 50 minutes for
Good.
your
I will,
speech.
I will try to use it as much as possible. Thank you for the kind introduction. Thank you for the invitation. I'm not sure whether I'm now in Central Europe or not. Rome is a hybrid. Not only your university is hybrid, also Rome is hybrid. Mediterranean, it's Central European. The more I go north in Italy, the more I feel Central European, for sure. That has to do with history, but also geography. Now, thank you for this introduction. The question really is, what is happening now? We are more than 500 days after the beginning of the Russian war of aggression in Ukraine. And on the one hand, we still have both sides thinking they can win this war, militarily and possibly politically. And at the same time, less and less interest in countries outside of the region, I guess including Italy. Also including my own country, Austria. The interest is decreasing with new conflicts everywhere. So we might say, well, what's happening in the Ukraine is just another conflict, as we experience in the European history, so many. When I am asked by Austrian or German journalists, what will happen? I said, as a historian, I can tell you, there is always a day after the war. There will always be a day after the war, but I don't know what it will look like and when it will be. So that's for sure. It's, in this regard, it's just another war. But for us, actually, in the 21st century, it's a turning point. It's an absolute turning point because of the idea that we found a solution that a declining Europe, the economic power, political power, military power of Europe is not growing, but it's declining. But in spite of this declining European power, we found a way to live together in a quite successful, peaceful way. And that was, with the exception of the Yugoslav wars, that was the case in the last 50, 60, 70 years. But then Russia decided against that. And that's why this is such a turning point. My first question always is, why does Russia attack Ukraine? Whenever I try to analyze the situation, why does Russia attack Ukraine? One can say, well, it has always been in the Russian mind to attack its neighbors. But from my time there, and also from the analytical point of view, I have to say there are mainly two reasons for the Russians. The one reason is the Russians still lack a clear national identity. There is still no clear Russian national identity since the end of the Soviet Union. Sometimes it includes all people who speak Russian, sometimes it's the Ruski Mir, sometimes it's the Belarusians, the Little Russians, and the Russians. Sometimes it includes the whole of Siberia, sometimes the Caucasus. No clear identity, with the one exception that it is very clear that the Russian integration of the 19th and 20th century was always an integration to assimilate, to become Russian, if possible. Always. And if they didn't want to assimilate, they were sent far away. You may have heard that the Soviet Union tried to integrate the Jews in Russia by sending them to Bielorussia, to an area which in the easternmost part of Siberia, where you have only mosquitoes. You used to have only mosquitoes in the 20s and 30s and nothing else. But Stalin thought, actually, we give the Jews of the Soviet Union something good. We give them their territory, which was far away. But this was, again, the idea to assimilate it and actually to bring it together. And this did not change. And this war proves that this is one of the basic problems of Russia, no clear national identity. And the second reason why the Kremlin and Putin and these people attack the Ukraine is the lost paradise. When you read most of the analysis that Mr. Putin writes about the loss of the Soviet Union, it feels like reading about the lost paradise. There are things that the Russians don't want to be reminded of. But most of the things, they tend to speak now as if it was the lost paradise for them. And we know what it means. It means we want to have an empire again. And this idea is very popular in Russia, that Russia deserves dignity, the Russian people deserve dignity, and that means that they deserve to be regarded on an equal footing with other empires. And the only empire they really want to compare themselves with, and that's hardly ever fully understood in Europe, is the United States of America. Only the United States of America are the partners they want to acknowledge to be on the same level. The European Union, no. I'm now telling you not as a historian, but as a diplomat, whenever I met either Mr. Putin or Mr. Lavrov, then they all told me, what is the European Union? What is the European Union? Why should we be interested in the European Union? We are interested in relations with Germany, possibly, and France, and Italy also, and Greece, Cyprus, Austria, a few friendly countries. But otherwise, our real partner is the United States of America. That's where we look as a comparative force. So you have these two elements which makes it so difficult to understand how to stop this war, because we cannot help them in the lost paradise case. Reconstructing the empire can't be in the interest of the other people living in this part of Europe, and we cannot help them either in the lack of national identity. What should we do? So what we can do is actually, we tried to do after the end of the Cold War. And I give you two examples of where Italy plays a role and then Hungary plays a role as a start. The first thing is when your foreign minister, Gianni De Michelis, became foreign minister in August 1989. He went to Bassano di Grappa, I think it was Bassano di Grappa, and gave a speech in front of the European Pathfinder Group annual meeting, 7th August 1989. The Farnesina people in the foreign ministry did not yet know what to do with de Michelis, being an intellectual, and he didn't have a speech prepared. So what did he do? He spoke about Central Europe. He spoke about that now we are happily overcoming the Iron Curtain, and I quote him, "It is impossible to create half a European unity." And there he announced that the Central European, more or less the regional political cooperation, which later became the Central European Initiative, was founded by Italy, Hungary, and Yugoslavia, at that time still Yugoslavia. So you had a socialist, young Italian foreign minister who understood what overcoming the Iron Curtain meant and what the role of Central Europe would be in such a new situation. And at that moment, it was very clear that this is it is not a continuation of the Soviet Union or of the Cold War situation, but this is something where from Central Europe there could be a change in the whole structure of the European integration project. And my second quote comes from last week, and that was the Hungarian Prime Minister who went to Beijing for the meeting, and there he met not only President Xi, but he also met President Putin. And the Kremlin, on the official website of the Russian president, with much enjoyment, obviously, quoted what he said after the meeting, I guess, with President Putin. Certainly, first he said, "This is my 13th meeting with President Putin since 2010 or 11. Then he said a few words that they have different positions on various things, military things. But that was not the point he made. Because the point he made was, he thanked President Putin. "I want to thank you for the fact that Rosatom remains our reliable partner." Rosatom is the Russian nuclear factory which exports nuclear material, fission material around the world, is the market leader in that, and the Hungarians depend for their nuclear power future that they want to have on Rosatom, on the Russian partner. And then he said, "I also want to thank Gazprom for fulfilling the contractual obligations. This helped us save much of what we have achieved together." Suddenly, you have a Central European Prime Minister going to meet Mr. Putin and saying, "We have achieved together so much." 500 days, more than 500 days into the war in Ukraine. So this is why I propose that I will speak about the Central European position of what's happening here. Is there a Central European position? And if yes, what could it really mean, the Central European position? The difficult thing in any lecture and analysis is the term itself, Central Europe. You have people who do a lot of studying, and you can make your career interpreting what Central Europe means or does not mean. I'm not following these sort of things. In the first book I wrote with a friend of mine in 1806, we said Central Europe is a project. It's something that is in the mind of people, which was at that time very true because it was mainly Jewish intellectuals who lived all around the globe, who spoke out for Central Europe as a sort of continent of ideas against the Cold War in Europe. So we could call it Project Central Europe, and anybody could participate. It was mainly intellectual in Czechoslovakia, in Hungary, Poland, and so on, but certainly because they had to be, but also in Italy, Yugoslavia, Austria. Now it's much more difficult. The second book, Central European Revisited, is much more difficult because Central Europe became, after the end of the Cold War, it simply became a group of new states, most of them new states actually, or at least with new borders. And it is hard to say that this is a region of ideas, of common ideas. It's a region of common interests, which is, by the way, not a bad thing, that now the Central Europeans talk more about interest than ideas, but the consequence is that these interests are what they have always been in the region between Germany and Russia. How can we survive? How can we survive as a partner between these two big powers that we have? So national interest plays a role. And that's where we are with Mr. Orban, meeting Mr. Putin, saying, our interest is we need energy at any price. Supplying our own population is the most important thing for a small country in Central Europe, and we don't have LNG terminals, we don't have sea border, so we need to work with Russia as much as we can. By the way, this is also true for a country like Austria. We also have a long-term energy contract with Gazprom, which goes until 2040, and which has not been signed after the wars, but it has been signed already after the sanctions, after Crimea. So it was signed in 2018. We signed a contract over 40 years of gas from Russia, and this is a contract the government doesn't even know what it looks like, because when our government tried to look into it, the company said, no, this is a contract we have, so it's not something that you can look in. So I would say when we ask the question, where is Central Europe and what is Central Europe, then it's all those communities, states, groups, which are dependent to a certain extent on either of the two sides of this region, either on the German side or on the Russian side. And the zones of influence are growing now. This war is the most obvious thing why we can say this, and this is also why in the book that was mentioned, the subtitle is Why Europe's Future Will Be Decided in This Region. Because the question is, who will dominate in this region? Will it be the European Union side or will it be the Russian side? For the time being, it looks very much as if Central Europe has decided. It has decided for Western integration, it has decided already after 1989 for security reasons, but also certainly for intellectual reasons. It decided to join NATO and the European Union. But now we realize, and with this war we see this, that each of the Central European countries is interpreting this decision in a different way. There are some of them which try to keep as much contact with Russia as possible. My country is among them. I mentioned already the energy issue, but it has also the idea of Austria as a neutral country. So which country made it possible for us to become independent again? That was the Soviet Union, 10 years after the end of the war. So there is some sort of feeling of obligation towards former Soviet Union. Although we say our neutrality is or has been decided by our own parliament, but actually without the Russian consenting 10 years after the end of the war, it would not have been possible. And then we can go through all the countries. Each of them has a little bit of a different interest in how it positions itself between the Russian side and the European Union side. Most of the countries in Central Europe are concerned with security, and that has to do with the geographical position of this. My country is not at all interested in security. I don't understand why. The only reason I can give for that is geography, that we are a bit further away from the war in the Ukraine than, for instance, the Baltic countries or Poland especially, or countries like Moldova. But Central Europe is an area where we have distances which we do not really can properly count. When you are Viennese like I am, it's difficult to explain to students, for instance, that Lviv, the capital of Western Ukraine, is closer to Vienna than the western province of Austria, in Vorarlberg. Even Tyrol and Innsbruck, I think, is further than Carinthia, not. Carinthia is a bit closer, but Lviv is closer than Tyrol and Vorarlberg. And so there you see geography is something very relative very often. It's about perception. And this is my point about why the Central Europeans have no common position on this. because every Central European country is looking into what is the historical context of my nation, of my state, and what is the geographical position that I have, and including in the geographical position the idea of energy supply and all the supply lines that are so important now. So Central Europe becomes somehow pressurized for economic terms between the West and Russia. And this has a tradition, unfortunately, in this region. And I'm now talking as an activist, not as an analytic, we Central Europeans are never in a good position when we are pressurized by both sides for economic reasons. And we are in no good position if we have to make a decision whether we would like to be only West or only East. But for the time being, that's what we are. Central Europe at the moment has to make decisions. And immediately when the Russians invaded Ukraine, rightfully, the decision that had to be made by all Central European countries was to show solidarity against the Russian war of aggression. This was obvious, and the Central European countries, all of them did it. But the more we go into this war, the more you see Central Europe has always been a sort of periphery region between East and West. And my expectation is that this will increase. So I'm not saying that the solidarity in the European Union will finally be gone away, but it will be much more difficult for political leaders to keep this support of the Ukraine active. And not because of the Middle East conflict or the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict or possibly conflict somewhere in Asia, but simply because of the fact that the Central Europeans have to think about the historical and geographic position, which has always been somehow dependent on these two big neighbors on both sides. So, and Central Europe, if there is a definition of Central Europe, it is small nation, big history, little power. Very short, but this is Central Europe. That's why Italy is only partly, but parts of Italy, as we know. And for most of these countries, that is simply true. So what is the political reaction to this? You can either join one of the big ones. That's what we Central Europeans did with joining the European integration, and most of the Central Europeans joining NATO. And you see already the question, why did most of the Central European countries join NATO faster than the European Union, is not only because it's more difficult to join, but it's because security is so important for the Central European countries. Economy is also important, but security is more important. And that's because Austria doesn't feel this security issue. We joined the European Union because we want to live comfortable lives, but we're not concerned about the Russians marching into Austria again. For a lot of people in my country, when we discuss this, they even say, actually, we are the only part of Europe where the Russian Red Army left after the Second World War a territory, which is true. They left immediately, well, 10 years after we left the eastern part of Europe. So the situation now with the position of Central European countries is that most of the countries feel like front-line countries again. Front-line countries in a, I would even say, in something which starts to look like a new Cold War. A new Cold War because it's not only that you have a clear-cut border between the Russian interest and the Western European interest, but also there's an ideological divide growing again. When you follow what Russian philosophers are counted and quoted by Mr. Putin and by the Kremlin, you realize they start to create this sort of fight between the decadent West again and the Russian Orthodox, very traditional, different civilization. So it's not us on the Western side which want to have this sort of Cold War idea of ideological separation, but it's the Russians, especially if Mr. Putin needs more support to be successful in this conflict. And that's why I feel more and more tense also to talk about these ideological aspects of the war. But there we are already into a bit leadership psychology, and I'm always very hesitant to follow this. But this is clear. We are going into some sort of Cold War situation where decisions are to be asked also by the Central European countries where we are, what our position is on this. And it is very obvious. I'm not supposed to tell you too much about the discussions that around Austrian security, but I can tell you that from the Russian side, there would be a lot of interest to be more friendly to my country, to even support them with more energy supplies, to have contacts on various levels. So this is a real situation where there's a challenge for the Central European countries to be taken out from the Russian side as countries which might be fifth columns within the Western integration project. And this will again, I think, grow. So what is there a hope still? I shouldn't be too long in my introduction. Is there a hope still for Central Europe? You might guess from I've written 2 books on Central Europe. I say yes. And by the way, that was interesting. When we wrote this book, that was 3.5 years ago, we had no idea about the Russian invasion, certainly. And we thought, okay, we wrote it in German, and it was nice because we wanted 30 years after the first book, 45 years, we wanted to see what has changed. But suddenly, the book sold in German. Everybody was interested in what's going on in this part now with Russians being active. And now it has been translated in 7 different languages already, not Italian, but most other European languages it's already been told. And there's an interest in this. And I think this is the right way to look at it. Because if we really want to see what will be the future of European integration, we have to understand why there are so different approaches, politically, but also mentally, to the integration project. We have to understand why. We have to understand why the Polish government, the still peace Polish government, can make use of the actually socialist policies for a right-wing party in the way they do, how they work with the Catholic Church in a way which is not feasible in countries like France or other countries. And the same is true for Hungary. I'm not supporting Mr. Putin and the Fidesz government, but it's worth understanding where they come from and why this happened. And the main reason is he could use the political steps that he does in Central Europe because of the constraints and the consequences of the end of the First World War, and he can use the fact that you have Hungarians living all around the country of today's Hungary, from Austria to Romania, and they always say 2/3 of ethnic Hungarians live outside of Hungary. This is, by the way, also one of the arguments the Orban government uses why they're not so much supporting the Ukraine. They're saying, we are not NATO members, but it doesn't matter, because as long as we don't get minority rights to the 150,000 ethnic Hungarians living in Western Ukraine, we will not let NATO troops or NATO weapons go through Hungary, even if they are a NATO member. And the Central European Austria, which is neutral, has Italian troops and Italians' weapons going through our neutral country to Poland and then to Ukraine partly without any problems. So you see, we tend to have in this part of Europe a situation where, first of all, it's not all geopolitics. It has a lot to do with the future of Europe, what happens here, and where we want to stand in this position. It has a lot to do that this sort of national idea that you have to make sure you supply everything for your country is becoming stronger again than it used to be. And to a certain extent, there is one thing for sure, as a Central European, I have to say, that at the moment it doesn't look that the idea of an ever closer political union of the European Union is an idea which will find real political support in most of the Central European countries. That's not a good news for the European integration, but after Brexit, it's anyhow a different continent we live in. But in most of the Central European countries, even a very technical thing like the unanimity principle for foreign policy decisions of the European Union will never be changed in the coming years, because none of the small countries in Central Europe will ever accept to give up the unanimity clause, because they say we have understood that we are living in a time where the big powers are playing the fiddle again. And if we don't keep the rights that we have in the European integration project, we will lose out. So this is just one of the elements where this happens. I am saying that it's a pity, actually, but I also am against doing away with the unanimity principle, but for a different reason, that I feel when you override the position of one of the 27, this can be used by populists in such a way that we get the next Brexit and the next Brexit because of the consequence that can be used in the political life, domestic political life in the Central European countries. So don't expect, I finish here with my last verse, don't expect that there will be a common Central European approach to the future of Europe, but expect that the problems coming from these smaller countries with their national different histories, different geographical position, different pipeline connections or not pipeline connections, they will be quite influential on the future of what's possible in the European integration, much more than was the case before the Russian war of aggression. So sorry to say so in Italy, which is one of the big member countries, but you will have to listen to us, smaller Central European countries, more than Italy and others. Well, Italy was not so bad, but others were talking so far. And this concerns mainly Germany and France. And that's my final point. The Central European countries in the next 5-10 years will not be enthusiastic about proposals from Germany and France about how the future will be like, like this last proposal which was done this summer, or the idea that there is something like a European political community. Most Central European countries are not so inspired by this sort of ideas because they see, and I include Austria, they see there is the idea that there is a Europe of different speeds. And we don't need new Europe of different speeds because there are second-class citizens and first-class citizens. And I can tell you, when we did research on this book, we found out that business was understanding this totally. Because in those Central European countries where the standard of living was lower, the quality of the products, which had the same name at the same price, was lower. And then people asked the business people, the marketing people of these companies, why is the case? Why do you sell it at the higher price, the same product, with different, less quality? And the answer of one of these marketing managers was, because the people in Slovakia have a different taste, different understanding of quality. That's not Europe, but that's what's happening. That's what's happening. So we have to live with this sort of differentiation, and that's why the resentment in some Central European countries is quite high. And yes, the Russian war binds us together on the right side, and with the solidarity we need in this context. And this will not totally go away, but it will be only kept if we keep also the Central European countries on board. And you look at Poland, the problem they had with the grain import summer from Ukraine. but also look at the situation on the Danube, where the transport of grain through the Romania and Bulgarian border is not so easy. And we know that military drones from Russia hit Romanian territory, but they don't say so officially, the Romanians. So these sort of things will stay with us in the coming years. But as I said, I'm optimistic that if the Europeans listen to the problems of historic and geographic situation of Central Europe, there is a good chance. There's not a chance for a close political union of the European integration, but there's a chance that we keep Europe alive and kicking and possibly even competitive. Thank you for your attention.
So thank you so much, Ambassador, for this wonderful speech. It was a very rich speech, and thank you so much also for your optimistic approach. As you're a diplomat, you find always the way to go further, and I think you recommended to find a new thinking on Central Europe, also in order to find a new identity for Europe, in which the security issue, as I understood, will be a key point for the future of Europe. So before, I have a lot of questions, but as this is a seminar for our PhD students, now I would like to give the floor to our students if they have some questions, or if you want to share with us and with the ambassador some of your reflection, as I know that some of our students study also some of the topics you touched in your speech.
Yes, it's fine.
It's fine, okay. And before, who wants to make a little speech, he can come here. But you have to come here and take the microphone. I want also to greet Karl Ehrlich from the Austrian Embassy. He's the first attaché of the Austrian Embassy, and he joined us during the speech. And also Dr. Gottsmann, from the director from the Austrian Historical Institute in Rome. So hello to both of you. So please, Dr. Madaio, if you can maybe also briefly present yourself and the topic on which you are working in the PhD course.
Thank you, Professor. Mr. Ambassador, many thanks indeed for your insightful speech. I'm Raffaele Madaio, a PhD student working on common security and defense policy. I'm taking a cue from a public paper from the Professor Ulrika Eider-Quercher on Austrian neutrality. So I would ask two questions. First, how the Austrian neutrality impact on the common security and defense policy, especially regarding to the opportunity to use the veto or the constructive absence. And second, if the EU should enhance a public debate aiming to reform the Lisbon Treaty, especially regarding to the Article 42. Thank you.
Well, if I may directly respond, because neutrality is a big question for the Austrians, at least. It's a big question. For Europe, it's not so much a big question anymore. As you know, we have in the European Union between 3 and 5 neutral countries. We don't know exactly how many are really neutral. My country has it in its fundamental law, so we are neutral, but it's a young neutrality, only from 1955. It's not really a problem, the Austrian neutrality for Europe. Why is it not a problem? Because we interpret the neutrality the way it suits us. It's like when it rains, you use the umbrella. When it doesn't rain, you use your sunglasses. That's our neutrality. So we interpret it that it's only, the limits are only military alliances. We are not allowed to join them. And secondly, no foreign troops on Austrian soil. Even their sometimes training troops are But with the exception of this military side of it, our interpretation is that everything is possible. Everything is possible. And we prove at the moment in this war that almost everything is possible. Because you know, when the war broke out, the question was, how can we help them, the Ukrainians, military, not only humanitarian and refugees, but also military. You know what? The NATO member, Germany, took longer to take a decision on sending helmets and vests to Ukraine than neutral Austria. We had no problem in sending helmets and vests. I agree, we don't send rockets, but anyhow, we don't have rockets, missiles. We don't have that. So from this side, we interpret our neutrality as not a restriction in the way we interpret the conflict. This is our political conviction, and it was said by our government officially. We decide that what is right and what is wrong, morally, but also how we act economically, whether we would like to follow sanctions or not. Everything is possible within the limits of our neutrality. That was our decision. What you call the political interpretation of neutrality. Neutralitätspolitik. And that has, in the case of Austria, nothing to do with the law. Once we really had to change the law, that was when we wanted to join the European Union. And there we hardly had a real discussion on that in Austrian Parliament. So it was no problem to change the law so that we could become a member of the European Union. And as you mentioned, there is Article 42, which says the members have to support each other. But there is, again, the limit for the neutral countries, the way they can respond to that. What does that mean? I think this is typically European Union speech. Everybody can interpret it the way they want to interpret it. I guess most of the NATO members in the European Union say that means that Austria has to support the others if they are intact territory. All means, maybe not with missiles because we don't have them, but otherwise. And for the majority of the Austrians, that means all the others have to support us. Not we have to support the others. So it's really a problem, and that has to do with our neutrality, that it is hard to convince a majority in the Austrian population what security really means. And as long as we stick to this idea that neutrality is somehow a security provider, it will be not possible to convince a majority of the Austrian population that security is not the same as neutrality. And there may be a situation when we are more secure if we have friends who support us and who we support. Also. So this is, I think this is still an open question. Did we change our position since the start of the war? Yes. There is no public discussion. I was among those who signed 2 public letters about asking for a discussion about neutrality and security concepts. We didn't even get a breath of response from the president or from the government. Nothing. Only when we asked via media, Austrian media again, did they get our letter? Then the office of the president said, yes, there was a letter. By the way, we forgot to answer it. That was a year ago. And then Austrian media started to be more interested, and now there is a sort of discussion on this, but which did not reach the political arena because, as we know, domestic politics is domestic politics. Next year we have elections in Austria, and when more than 80% of the population is in favor of neutrality, which they understand as welfare, money, no problems. So it's just a feel-good factor, neutrality in Austria. Then you cannot act politically if you are a party which wants to get more than possibly 10%. You can't do it. So there is one party, the NEOS party, the Liberal Party. They have got about 10%. So they act against neutrality and they say we need a European army and we should be integrated in that. But they know it's not. They will never get majority. For the other parties, no way, and this will not change. So do we want to have a new treaty in the European Union? Yes, we would like to have a new treaty. I think the present government would like to have changes, but there are a few limits, and these limits, as I said, one of them is unanimity principle in foreign security policy issues, and the second is this Beistandsklausel, so this article where neutral countries can act in a different way from other countries. What we really want is enlargement of the Western Balkan countries. And there we are with Italy in the same boat. We are very much in favor of doing this. At least I hope we are in the same boat as Italy. When it gets closer to the farmers from countries like Ukraine, possibly the boat will shrink. In Poland already, there is a discussion whether Poland will be supportive of Ukrainian integration once it's a question of the agricultural products coming cheap into the union. Will also be a problem with our farmers. But as long as it's on the level of do we want them to be politically part of Europe? Yes. But that's a big issue, and there maybe change of treaties can help us, but for the time being, majority of countries, I have the feeling, do not want to have a treaty change. Especially Germany and France have no interest.
Thank you.
Are there some other questions? So please, you have the floor.
Journalist and PhD students, first year, an old one, so with a long history. Thank you for your speech. I agree with you that for Russia the problem is the identity is a big problem. So speaking of Russia in its foreign policy and also in the domestic policy. So all the problem with the different ethnic groups, but since you already spoken about Austrian neutrality, I would like to ask you something about the Visegrad group. You know, the coming back of Robert Fico in Slovakia, and do you think that this war and all the issues related to security for this frontier country as a connection with this war? I mean, for example, I remember I was in Slovakia with the first gas crisis in 2006, skiing in Liptovská Teplica, which is a little village in the Tatra mountain, and I know how it does affect these gas issues more than here in Italy. We can perceive it in a different way. And also, I was thinking about the rising conflicts again with, for example, Hungarian and Slovakia. How does this war affect also this relationship between these four countries? So Poland, Slovakia, Czech Republic, and Hungary. Thank you.
Well, the Visegrad cooperation between these four countries is actually the only regional cooperation which has such a long life and is still of importance. So I'm not so critical about the Visegrad 4 cooperation, and it survived already a lot of ups and downs. It survived changes of government in Poland, also in Hungary, Slovakia, in the Czech Republic, in all of these countries. Why did this survive? I would say because there is still this memory of the communist time. In all four countries, they had this memory of the Soviet occupation. That binds them still together. And they had similar issues of wanting to join the European Union. Similar interests, similar issues. So that was very good. Now that they are members of the European Union, and almost already old members of the European Union, interests got more differentiated. And as we know, for instance, a big issue is the euro integration, and in the Visegrad countries you have very different positions on whether they should accept the euro and the European Central Bank. And this will be also true for other parts. And this is, on the one hand, it has to do with who is running the country politically. Like in Hungary and Poland and in Slovakia, the change of government means a change of interest in the Visegrad cooperation. But also, what is the long-term interest of a given country? And that is different. So Central Europe becomes, I would say, Central Europe, these Visegrad countries, become more Habsburg Austria. The more they get away from the Soviet Union, the more they become Habsburg Austria with all the problems of integration, of how they can work together, what their interests are, and where they see the problems. So Brussels used to be compared by Visegrad politicians to Moscow. And now it becomes compared to Vienna, to the Habsburg Vienna of that time. So this is a major change. Maybe this is just for the time being, but we realize it from the Austrian perspective. And sometimes it makes it difficult because people tend to ask, why is Austria not also part of this cooperation, Visegrad cooperation? And then the answer is always because the others didn't invite us. And that's true. The other 4 countries didn't invite Vienna because the Austrians, they have this tradition of Habsburg imperialism, of Habsburg superiority. That's the German-speaking part of Central Europe. So there are good historical reasons why the others didn't invite us. I, as a diplomat, was always in favor of Austria joining. I did not succeed. And you know, maybe I could have succeeded. The Poles were the problem, because the Poles were afraid that Poland will be not the first fiddle in this, but Austria. But the real problem was my own minister and my own government, because they said, no, we are Austria. We don't want to join something like the Visegrad Forum. We want to join and rule this grouping, so we create a new concept. We call it regional partnership. And suddenly, in 2010, Austria invented the idea of a regional partnership, which included the Visegrad countries, Austria, and Slovenia. Naturally, the other 4 were not interested. So we made mistakes. But in Central Europe, these sort of mistakes are very typical because we always we understand how culturally different this region is, that we have to overcome divergences. But on the other hand, we want to have our small nationalistic pride. We don't want to share our pride of our patriotism with the neighbors. That's when you look into Austrian literature, you find a lot of this. Also in Czech literature. So, what will happen with Fico now? Fico is not a new phenomenon in Slovakia. And all people I talked in Slovakia, they say he will not change dramatically his foreign policy approach. Many of the things that he said about no sanctions, we should actually understand Russia, was for domestic consumption in the election period and not when he becomes prime minister. And the same is true for the change in Poland, actually. The Poles will never use their patriotism, even if they have a pro-European liberal government, presumably now in December. They will still be Poles, which will be difficult. But this is part of the Central European experience, and I think this is the strength that we can learn in the European integration, that we have all these differences, which we have to find a solution to keep it all together. I fully agree. It would be much easier if we only have the Germans and the French, and Italy as the nice place where you can dine and lunch, and that's Europe. No, we need the small places. And I'm saying this as an Austrian who always has the problem, used to have the problem, to explain why we are not German. But this is gone, actually. Nobody asks an Austrian now, the last 20, 30 years, why we are not a German. Austria is so different. It's so Central European. And now with the actually open borders since 1989, especially Vienna, is so Central European. You have in the Viennese primary schools, more than 50% of the pupils are non-German speaking at the mother tongue. More than 50%. And they are not mostly Syrians, but they are mostly from the Balkans. So part of our own flesh in Europe. And so Austria is growing into the Central European role. And maybe it's for us, it's easier than for a country where like Slovakia, which had identity problems also throughout the decades. But I'm quite optimistic, and I'm staying on purpose. Visegrad 4 will continue to play a role, whichever government is there in this country. My feeling.
Someone else? Yeah, please come. Dr. Mikari.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your speech, and thank you, professors, for this opportunity. I have a question about the interparliamentary cooperation, also because there is, let's say, a difference between some scholars. Someone thinks that there are really different things, parliamentary diplomacy and interparliamentary cooperations, while other thinks that they are more or less the same, interparliamentary cooperation, the institutional version of parliamentary diplomacy. So my question is about the possibility that this instrument, this institutional instrument, can be a strong or valid instrument to find a common position and also, let's say, to build a European identity in future, in particular after the Russian war. Also because if we think about the conclusions in the Conference of Presidents of National Assemblies, we can find a really strong and common position in support of Ukraine. And if we also listen some videos about this kind of meeting, for example, the last one in 2023, we can find also the possibility that Central European states have shown the position about Ukraine, and then the common, not exactly identity, and not, of course, common decisions, but common position. I mean, these are really strong against the Russian war and the position about European Union in support of Ukraine. So do you think that if we think about perspective and our future, this could be a valid, strong instrument for our identity, European identity? Thank you very much.
Am I allowed to be skeptical about parliaments? Yeah? Okay.
You have been a lot optimistic.
I was
Till
optimistic,
now,
now
yeah.
I can be a bit pessimistic. I love all the parliaments in Europe, and also the European Parliament, and the Council of Europe. And I am convinced that we need emotions in foreign policy. And they stand for the emotions, and I follow whatever the European Parliament is doing about creating some sort of idea of European identity. But I'm not convinced that such a top-down approach by parliamentarians will change a iota. I give you one example. It was already some time ago that the European Parliament decided to have a House of Europe, to create in Brussels a House of Europe, a House of the history of Europe. And it's paid for by the Parliament, and when you look into it, you don't get an idea what Europe is. It's just a chronological explanation from Karl the Große to Schumann. That's not Europe. And then they do not know how to respond to the fact that Europe and European Union are two different things. What to do with Switzerland, or not to say of Ukraine? Or is Russia part of a House of Europe or not? And the European Parliament wanted to do something good. So they said, no, we don't have identity enough, so let's have at least a museum of Europe. Visit it, you will see how difficult it is to have such a thing. All our countries are active there. There's a historian board working on it. And I have a course with my students on politics of memory at the Diplomatic Academy in Vienna. They always use the example of this house. That's simply politics of memory. The attempt that you can create something, identity, when you use narratives from the past. I don't say this reminds me of Mr. Putin, how he sees history. Strategies are not so different. Sorry, I'm saying too much, maybe too much, but it's not so different. It's trying top-down to create some sort of narrative which you put into the heads of people. And why I'm saying this, it's not so far away from the Russians, is when you look what the European Union does on the idea of totalitarianism in the 20th century. They have one and another resolution where they fully compare National Socialism and the Holocaust with the Gulag system and the Soviet Union. And I'm all in favor of condemning both. But the European Parliament, in their emotional fight, they are all together. There are famous resolutions where they put them together, although they are criticized for doing that. Not only the Russians are not very happy about this, they used to be happy, but it's wrong actually, the way they do it, because they are even putting more stress against communism. This has to do with communistic party possibly in Western Europe, than against the Nazis and the Hitler Reich. And this is one of the problems of parliamentary foreign policy, that it has to be so fully fledged, emotional sometimes, that it is hard to use it for trust building or for finding dialogue, solution in a dialogue or compromise. That's why, in this context, I think diplomats, bilateral diplomats, or institutions which are a bit more technical, like the commissions of the Council of Europe, than the European Parliament, are more helpful in parliamentary cooperation. I'm very much in favor of the Venice Commission and their work on rule of law and minority rights and so on, yes. And I also think in the OSCE context, the parliamentarians are more helpful because of the emotion they bring to the table than the bureaucracy of the OSCE. Again, this is something I should not say as an Austrian diplomat, because we want to keep the OSCE alive in Vienna. It saves us a lot of diplomats living in Vienna. But our foreign minister, and he rightfully says so, we believe in the future of the OSCE. But I'm saying that bureaucracy was less successful maybe than the so-called parliamentary side of the OSCE. So my answer is not a full no, but only parts of it can be helpful.
Oh, thank you. There aren't any other questions. I think we can pass to Professor Ungari, who has the wonderful work now to make the conclusions of this very, very interesting afternoon.
Thank you, Ulrike. I would like to thank to the Ambassador Brix for this important speech in this evening about the question of the Central European countries. I think its speech is very interesting and explain the position of these countries in Central Europe. I agree with him about the reasons of the Russia attacks to Ukraine, about the national identity. That's very a question for Russian population after the collapse of communism, and also and more about the idea to realize a new empire. Empire against the US, against European Union, and of course this is one of the most important issue for the future, for the political diplomacy of Russia in the next years, because it's necessary to solve this question, because it's impossible to think for the elite of Kremlin to realize a very ancient, very old war, because it's a war is incredible. This decision is a failure. Is a failure for intelligence. Is a failure for the army. Also today, this military situation is in standby for each countries. But the idea to realize an invasion with tanks, with the drone, with the army is realize an idea of the Second World War. No, as the Europe collapsed again in the Second World War. It's a very old war from Kremlin elite. Yes, De Michelis talked about the quadrangolare, no? During the phase of crisis of the Yugoslavia, the idea to approach the crisis of communism with the quadrangolare, with the leading role for Italy, is quadrangolare. Because this is the idea of the two different foreign policy for Italy, no? One in Mediterranean area, and in the other hand, one in the central area, Central European area. But the idea collapsed with the crisis of Yugoslavia. I appreciate so much this historical reconstruction of the Central European country, but also the Central European history, because it's true, these countries are divided between Russia and Germany. History of all these countries. When I was young, I made a trip in the US for job to the archives, and I met a couple of young married Polish people. Okay, the history was the grandfather of the woman was killed by Russian. The grandfather of the man was killed by German. For example, this is the dramatic history of Poland, no? Divided after the end of the French Revolution in three countries: Prussia, Austria, Habsburg Empire, and Russia. And this is really a very dramatic history of the Central European state. Now, for us, for Italy, but I imagine for Portugal or Spanish people, it's very difficult to conceive. And I think this aspect explained his attitude to the Russian-Ukraine war, and I think explained his approach of this country. Maybe the enlargement of European Union has been too fast. Maybe. Maybe too fast because now the fast equilibrium between all the parts of Europe it's impossible to reconstruct, and now it's very difficult to realize a dialogue between very different areas with different history, with different heritage, Habsburg Empire, or of course Spanish, for example, or Italy too. And but I think I want to be optimistic about Europe, but I think it's necessary to. I think it's not important to reconstruct, but to rethink European Union, because today it's impossible to go away with this idea of a European Union based on Brussels, based only on Paris and Berlin, because now this doesn't work. This is I think it's a main focus for the next year for the European Union. And I thank again Ambassador Brix because he approach he gives a great impulse to reflection about this theme, about this central question for all the European countries, all the European peoples, because today the destiny of the Central European countries is also the destiny of the European Union. Thank you.
Oh, we finished and we go home with a lot of reflections, with a lot of new ideas on the future of Europe.
And the idea for myself is that Rome should play a bigger role also in the European project. As was mentioned, not Brussels, Berlin, and Paris, but Rome. That means also the Mediterranean side of Europe.
And then we have already the topic for our next seminar. So thank you for all of you for participating. Thank you so much for Mr. Brix that you gave us this wonderful speech. Thank you also for your wife that she is also here. And we wish you a good stay in Rome. And I hope we can see you again. Thank you so much.